In times of widespread dissatisfaction with American politics, the idea of a third party often emerges as a potential solution. Many people wonder why there isn't an alternative party for the majority of Americans who feel some level of hostility towards both Democrats and Republicans. This proposition is similar to the notion of throwing the bums out and rests on the belief that our problem lies with the parties and the individuals comprising them. However, I aim to argue against this perspective. It is not that our parties are inherently flawed, rather, it is our system that is flawed. The American political system is plagued by perverse incentives that inevitably force any major party with a realistic chance of winning elections to become similar to the existing two parties. There are generally two types of third-party proposals that people advocate for. Radical third parties. These parties prioritize different issues or propose alternative solutions to existing problems compared to the major parties. Centrist third parties. These parties aim to bridge the gap between the two major parties, which are often seen as overly partisan. Both types of third-party proposals suffer from two primary flaws. They are not electorally viable, as they are unlikely to achieve a level of dominance comparable to the major parties. Even if they manage to gain traction, they will eventually assimilate into the existing party system and become similar to the major parties. Let's examine each type of third-party proposal in more detail. Radical third parties. To understand why a radical third party is not feasible, we must examine how the Republican and Democratic parties have evolved to their present positions. For the sake of simplicity, let's assume that the primary objective of these parties is to win elections. If a strategy or platform makes winning elections more difficult or impossible, parties will eventually discard it in a collectively rational manner. We can observe several examples of such adjustments in the recent history of the Democratic Party. George McGovern's campaign in 1972 was considered too radical and was decisively defeated by Richard Nixon. In contrast, Jimmy Carter, the Democratic candidate in 1976, adopted a more centrist approach. However, even Carter's moderate stance proved insufficient against Ronald Reagan in 1980, just as Walter Mondale in 1984 and Michael Dukakis in 1988 faced similar outcomes. Eventually, the Democrats realized that offering a relatively radical alternative to Reagan/Bush policies would not lead to success. In 1992, they made a significant move towards the center with Bill Clinton, who championed the third way and supported welfare reform, a policy previously unimaginable for Democratic candidates. In order to win elections, parties must maximize their appeal to voters. Assuming American politics can be simplified as a left-right contest between Democrats and Republicans, most voters fall within a centrist range, while smaller minorities hold more extreme left or right positions. Parties seeking continuous control of the government will strive to become the king of the hill, occupying the center ground while pushing the opposing party towards one extreme. This way, they can secure a larger share of votes for themselves and diminish the opponent's support. To illustrate this visually, let's imagine the current political situation as follows. The Republican Party is increasingly dominated by Tea Party elements, placing it far to the right and requiring gerrymandering to win elections in certain districts, hence their control of the House of Representatives, which is influenced by state legislatures, while the Democrats maintain a small advantage. The dividing line represents the split between voters, assuming that those who fall between the positions of the two parties divide evenly. This configuration gives the Democrats a slight but stable national advantage. Now, let's consider the introduction of a radical third party. Suppose we want a highly progressive third party. What would happen then? We would see the following. The introduction of a radical third party would split some Democratic voters, giving the Republicans a clear and stable national advantage. The presence of a radical third party only guarantees the victory of a viewpoint that is less favorable to radical voters. To avoid being divided and conquered, the long-term goal of the radical third party would have to be the elimination and assimilation of the defeated party. If the radicals were to succeed in dissolving the Democratic Party, the result would be as follows. The demise of the Democrats would grant more votes to the radicals. However, it would also lead to an increase in centrist voters supporting the Republicans. As a result, the Republicans would still maintain a small but stable national majority. Furthermore, this assumes that the Republican Party remains dominated by the Tea Party and positioned farther down the hill. Eventually, the Republicans would once again strive to become kings of the hill, solidify their rule, and make it harder for others to challenge them. A radical party, by its nature, resists taking the hill, thus guaranteeing its electoral failure. It would also widen the gap between the two parties, exacerbating polarization. For a radical party to succeed, it would need to move up the hill, becoming similar to the Democrats. Inevitably, pressure from donors and voters to accomplish something would push the party toward the center, just as Bill Clinton did in 1992 when the Democratic Party represented a hypothetical radical party. Centrist third parties. The idea of a centrist third party has gained traction recently, with some suggesting that the Republicans should abandon the Tea Party and move toward the center. However, this concept has existed for some time as a compromise approach. Let's analyze the recent suggestion first. What would happen if the Republicans severed ties with the Tea Party? We would have the following situation. This situation mirrors the outcome of the creation of a radical party, but it is even worse for the Republicans because the Democratic Party is currently positioned higher up the hill than the Republican Party. Either the Republicans would perish, and the Tea Party would become a minority radical party until it eventually decides to move up the hill, or the Tea Party would fade away, resulting in a stalemate, albeit with less polarization than we currently have. Abandoning the Tea Party may be a wise long-term move for Republicans, but only if their intention is to eliminate it rather than coexist. However, by bringing the two major parties closer together, this approach eradicates any meaningful choice. We would essentially have one significantly large party with different names, resembling the political system of the Soviet Union. What if we were to conceive a centrist third party that perfectly aligns with the most common views? We would end up with the following scenario. A party of centrists faces two major problems. A centrist party would struggle to differentiate itself from the Democrats, making it essentially indistinguishable. Not only would centrists lose, but they would also alter the game, incentivizing the other parties to become more extreme. How does the second point come into play? A centrist party, by definition, occupies the center and becomes the king of the hill. Consequently, neither party has any incentive to pursue the hill or gain ground on the other side, as doing so would blur the distinction between them and the centrists. In the example above, the Democrats have no reason to resist moving slightly down their side of the hill. As long as they remain higher on their side than the Republicans on theirs, the Democrats would still win elections. Consequently, the introduction of a centrist party would further polarize politics and diminish the influence of centrist Americans. While the two major parties currently compete for control of the center, the creation of a centrist party renders centrist voters irrelevant and prompts each party to cater to its respective base. Based on this analysis, it is clear that the third-party solution is not a solution at all. If we desire different politics and policies, either voters must change their positions significantly, rendering the current bell curve obsolete, or the voting system must undergo substantial reform. The former is unlikely to occur in the near future, while the latter two options are currently politically unfeasible. Creating new parties cannot remedy our predicament. Instead, we must either alter our own perspectives or transform the system that determines which views prevail.